going to bring our friend Keith, who is going from Audacious Inquiry. He had offered to read the rules over Twitter, and we thought that would be a valiant effort, and we've given him half an hour to read the rules, 1,000 pages, and he's up for it, and he's promised some Shakespeare as was requested on the tweet. So Keith, without further ado, on to you.
So I'll start off with the Shakespeare. So here we go, with apologies to William. Oh, for a muse of fire that would transcend the brightest HL7 of invention, a country for a stage, CEOs to act, and patience to behold the swelling scene. Then should the humble Posnack, like himself, assume the port of Mars, and at his heels, leashed in like hounds, should famine, sword, and fire crouch for employment. But pardon, in gentles all, the flat unraised spirits that have dared on this unworthy parchment to bring forth so great an object. Can this cockpit hold the vasty tomes of regs? Or may we cram within this short time, oh, the very reams that did affront the air at the register? Oh, pardon, since a crooked figure may attest in little place 5 megabytes, and let us ciphers to this great accompt on your portable documents work. Suppose within the girdle of this time are now confined these mighty industries, whose high portals and abutting interface the perilous narrow oceans part asunder. Piece out our interoperability with your thoughts. Let 1,000 flowers bloom upon man. And make imaginary puissance. Think when we talk of servers that you off them, sending their resources into the receiving net, for 'tis your data that now must deck your apps. Carry them here and there, jumping over times, turning the accomplishment of many years into an hourglass for the which supply. Admit me, chorus, to this history, who prologue like your humble patience pray, gently to hear and kindly to judge our reading. So what I'm going to do today is show you how to get through the rule when your boss needs an answer from you about what do we need to worry about, and you need to do it in an hour and you've got 1,200 pages to read. So let me see if I can go ahead and share my screen. And I'm of the belief that everybody can now see my screen and hear me.
Yes, they can.
Awesome. So here we have the rule, and I have a special version courtesy of Corey Spears. Link available on Twitter and also on Cures and patient access resources available on my blog. It's bookmarked with all of the important sections. So if you open up in Acrobat, you actually have a working and functional table of contents. There's a lot of stuff in this rule. There's over 1,200 pages to get through, and we're going to try to get you the essential pieces in 22 minutes now. I'm sorry. I can't do my math. 20, anyway. Less than a half hour. So we're going to start first real quickly and say there's a lot of stuff in here that we can just plain old skip. But we will start with the executive summary. Don't need to know anything about the background. This is where ONC is going to tell you this is everything that happened before. You already know this. You already should have some notion about deregulatory action being important. What this is also telling you is that there's stuff that's been taken out of the current rule. For example, actually, this is still talking about what's been done in the past with respect to deregulatory action. So we can skip that. So already you can see we're on page 45. Now we get to updates to the 2015 edition certification criteria. And we're sort of just going to scan through this and start to look at what's in here. Actually, I'm sorry, I should have done this piece. So here's the critical piece that we need to define. It's the summary of major provisions. This is the important section to start with. This really tells you what they've done. So they're looking for what they can cut out. They finalized a number of deregulatory actions. They are removing randomized surveillance. 2014 edition of certification criteria is now removed. As they proposed, they are no longer going to have an ONC approved accreditor in this program. And they removed certain features of the 2015 edition certification criteria. We're going to have to read the rule to get to the detail of that. And certain other program requirements. They had suggested that they would recognize FDA's software pre-certification program, but decided against that. They made some updates. They adopted the US or United States Core Data for Interoperability, US CDI. This is yet the third name for what I originally talked about on my blog, is there can be only one, that common data set that is going to be used for interoperability. It's got a new name, it's got new governance, but it's still basically that same set of 18 data elements that we know and love. But there's now a process in which that's going to grow. E-prescribing, they went from NCPDP script 10.6 to 2017-071, which is the latest version of NCPDP script, and that is the version that is consistent with the CMS regulation, as they mention below right here in this section of text. One of the things that you have to pay attention to when you're reading through the current rule is what you learned when you went through the proposed rule. They said they were thinking about removing this because it was a pain in the neck to have to certify something that you were going to not use because you were going to use this guide to do your reporting. They are now confirming, yes, that's what we're doing. They had some complexity around electronic health information export. They are going to propose that there is EHI export and retain some of that flexibility, but they also note that they've made some modifications in response to public comment. They refine it to the scope of what's been certified as to what must be exported. Then they talk about application programming interfaces and a new standardized API. And here is the first mention of Fire Release 4. Does anybody know how many mentions of Fire Release 4 are in the rule? No answer?
Boston University.
So the answer is going to be over 200. I'm guessing around 260. 236, I was wrong. I was high. So fire is extremely important in this rule. Privacy and security transparency attestations. So they talked a lot in the proposed rule about how they're going to have you attest to conforming to privacy and security certification criteria. Attestation is important in regulation because what you attest to, you are legally responsible for and can be prosecuted under false claims should you attest incorrectly or unfaithfully. There have been punishments meted out to EHR vendors for flaws in their attestations. So this is something that seems mild when it says, well, you have to attest. It's not just you have to attest, it's you have to attest and we can hold you accountable. Security tags and consent management. They talked about how they wanted to adopt DS for data segmentation for privacy, or otherwise known as TS for P. Supporting tags basically on the clinical content. There'd been some concerns that the tags weren't granular enough, and they said, well, you can tag it. But furthermore, even though you can tag it, the receiver doesn't necessarily have to bag it, which means that they don't necessarily have to treat it specially, but they do have to be able to accept the fact that it has been tagged. There are a number of modifications to the certification program, some corrections to the security and privacy certification framework, some adjustments to the certification companion guides. They updated the principles of proper conduct. A lot of that addresses issues with respect to new provisions in 171, as one might suggest from having read the proposed rule. They're also requiring ONC ACBs to accept test results from any ONC authorized testing laboratory in good standing. So one of the issues here is that ACBs and ATLs can sometimes function or be operated by the same entity. And so this is ensuring that even though an ACB might also operate as an ATL, they have to accept content from other authorized testing laboratories. And they've added and updated their records retention provisions throughout the rule. A lot of that is in relationship to the new section 171. There's some discussion around health IT for the care continuum and supporting care for pediatric healthcare providers. What they say is, we thought a lot about how we might solve this particular problem. We're looking at ways to make it better. And in the end, we've identified what already exists in what we're currently doing that will support this. And you can probably expect what's coming, which is we'll let you know when we have more information in that particular area. So they've only covered, this is what we're already doing, and there will likely be more coming. Also, a lot of discussion around opioid use disorder, which they are actively reviewing. So there are a number of questions that showed up in the proposed rule. This was one of the areas where they'd specifically asked a question about opioid use. And what they're saying is, we got a lot of feedback. We're currently looking at it. Nothing in this rule is going to address that. That's one of the things you have to understand when you're reading the rule. When ONC asks for feedback, or any regulatory agency asks for feedback, but have not suggested that they're going to make a regulation, they will not make regulation. There's actually regulations around how regulations are made and what needs to be said in a regulation before the agency can actually regulate on the particular topic. They did establish a new section around conditions and maintenance of certification, which was one of those sections that was a cause of deep discussion in industry. They are distinguishing that there are conditions of certification and there's maintenance of certification as sort of separate components. And there's this big section 171 that was added for which it becomes a condition of certification in the program. As part of those maintenance requirements. They also talk about the fact that health IT developers not prohibit or restrict communications about the performance of health IT, all of this basically addressing things like gag clauses in contracts. So there are certain types of restrictions that they're allowed to impose that do strike a balance, promoting communication providers, but in the main, people are allowed to communicate. And they are also allowed to communicate using screenshots and video. Okay, so as we're going through this, also that if there is a gag clause, it's not going to be enforced. You've got to have APIs. You've got to publish the API content. There's got to be enough information in here to actually implement the API. So not just here's the APIs. We're not going to go into the real world. We're not going to go into enough details so that you can actually implement. There's requirements here that there must be enough information to implement. There was a requirement in the proposed rule around real world testing. They further elaborated on that in this rule. So SVAP flexibility. You can use approved ONC approved newer versions of more of the secretary adopted standards. That's an interesting phrase. Secretary adopted standards or implementation specifications. I heard that phrase more than a decade ago. Probably a decade and a half ago through what I call the first ONC program, interface with NCPDP, where the Secretary of HHS adopted standards or implementation specifications available for a criterion. If you read through some of the proposed text in US CDI, what you're going to come to learn is that the adoption of standards is likely to go through a change in the regulatory process, being turned into a sub-regulatory action where the Secretary annually will publish a list of standards that have been adopted or selected, quite likely with the involvement of federal advisory committees such as US CDI, which is responsible for identifying data elements and adopting standards for communicating them. And so this process that we're going through on a every other or every third year basis with lots of interruptions for lots of various and sundry reasons is about to become more frequent, subregulatory, with the benefits of being able to have lots more public discussion around what's happening. And we haven't really gotten into a whole lot of detail about what that's going to look like. I believe that's some of what US CDI is going to be working on throughout their next year. But if you hadn't been around for the last decade and a half, you might not have spotted that signal about what could potentially be changing there. So then we see more about ONC ACBs. Most of that I'm going to skip because there's a very small number of ACBs in this. There's discussion around attestations, EHR reporting criteria. So EHRs, this text, I can't tell you how many years I've been reading this text. We have not yet established an EHR reporting program. Once we establish such a program, we will undertake rulemaking to propose how that's going to be dealt with. So as we keep scanning through this, now we get to a huge new section, information blocking, which is also the last section we're interested in the summary. They identify 8 reasonable and necessary activities that are exceptions to information blocking definition. They're set forth in a particular section of the final rule. And I'm just looking for where there might be some useful discussion that we can talk about here. An actor will not be subjected to enforcement actions for civil monetary penalties or appropriate disincentives. And there's more stuff in the rule about decertification and certification bans that are appropriate disincentives, so long as your practice satisfies at least one exception. They will evaluate on a case-by-case basis to assess specific facts and circumstances. And we're going to skip costs and benefits. One of the interesting things about most rules, generally you can completely skip both the summary and the detailed discussion of costs and benefits, and we're going to do that for this particular rule as well. Almost never is there any feedback on the proposed rules costs and benefits analysis that's done in the regulatory impact analysis section.
Hey, Keith, there's a question for you. One question was, why aren't you doing this from a motorcycle?
Because I need to look at the road when I ride, not at my screen.
And actually further on, why is that your handle?
Why is that my handle? Read my first blog post. Basically, I showed up at a health IT conference in Hartford, Connecticut. Rode down, and a young lady from Canada who was traveling to the same conference. It was her birthday, so I gave her a motorcycle ride for her birthday as we attended. We showed up. I came down in leathers and my motorcycle jacket. She had hers on. We had a pair of helmets on. We walked down to the center of the auditorium, took off our jackets, laid our helmets down, and jumped up on the stage. We were the presenters. To an audience of a couple hundred health IT experts in Connecticut. A day later, I heard back that the CTO in a summary meeting said, for those of you who were here yesterday, you know, we had an awesome conference. For those of you who weren't, there was this awesome motorcycle guy who showed up with this chick, and they solved all of our problems. That's when I needed a name for the blog. I recalled his introduction of me not 6 months later to his senior advisory committee when I was on a conference call. He said, most of you already know who Keith Boone is. For those of you who don't, he's that motorcycle guy.
That's awesome. That
Best
is
introduction ever.
blog. So yeah, thank you. So I think I'm going to have derailed you. You're kind of making your way through, but.
So on the regulatory impact analysis, the point is usually you can skip this. There was a lot of feedback on this section. All right, so now we get to the fun part. We skip all the prefatory material and we go straight to the rule. The reason we do that is because the prefatory material is what ONC has to say about why they did what they did. I don't care. I want to know what you did and I want to react to what you did. And I want to have my gut raw reactions as I'm reading the rule. And then I'll go back and listen to all of the excuses and justifications and feedback and whining and complaining, or good feedback and interesting adjustments that are made. And don't get me wrong, I give ONC a lot of grief. They did a bang up job on this. Steve Posnack and his team put together a really tremendous piece of work. And you can tell by the size of it. The size of it does not reflect their work. It actually reflects the fact that they got tremendous feedback on this rule. So we can look at 170.101, which talks about applicability, and say, we don't need to worry about that. They already told us they're removing 2014, they're changing 2015. They're revising the definition of common clinical data set. They're making some tweaks to what the definition of EHR is, and they're changing some of the standards for the common clinical data set to updated standards, because all of this 170.200 series stuff is where the standards live. So we'll get to some good stuff there. Okay, you can see that they made some updates to the definition of what vital signs are. They note that BMI is optional, but all of this is pretty much minor tweaks, updates to specific standards. And you'll see those updates when we get to that 170.200 section. See, we've skipped past a whole bunch of pages, and at the rate we're moving, we've got about 3 minutes to get through the rest of the rule. I don't know that we're actually going to manage it, but we're going to make a reasonable attempt. We see that we have a new definition, health information technology. We have the definition of interoperability. Okay. So this is interesting in that it does not actually follow in complete form all of the patterns that have been followed in the past. In fact, it's actually including the new IEEE definition of interoperability that includes that without special effort on part of the user, but then also says allows for complete access exchange and does not constitute information blocking. What's new? Oh, now we start to get into the standards. CCDA templates for clinical notes, R2.1 companion guide release 2. That's a minor update to the standard. NCPDP, we already heard about that one. New version of the CMS quality guide. New version of QRDA category 3. US CDI as a new standard. And here we go, fire, US core, and SMART. All of these standards that will be needed to be adopted. We'll skip section 299. That's all incorporation by reference. That gives you the references of the material. You'll see that section 314, that was the 2014 criteria is removed. 2015 criteria is being amended. It's no longer medication allergies, it's allergies and intolerances, because there's more than just medication allergies. There have been standards that have been updated. A lot of these changes are going to be to introduce the new standards. Anytime you see a reference that says from 205 to 205, it means it's a change to the standard. You can see that they've added a new section, the assessment plan of treatment, goals, health concerns, etc. There's more data here. So already in a half hour, we've gotten through 1,159 pages of the rule. We've not read through the whole rule, but you already in this half hour have learned what the major provisions are. You've started to learn how to identify those things that you can skip, how you can identify things like, oh, 205, that whole 200 section is about standards. This means there's a change in the standard. So the big thing about how you can get through these rules quickly is to make sure you read the executive summary first, read the rule next, and we're just skimming through this right now. We're not doing a deep read because my boss needed to know the answer an hour from now or half hour from now. And you could tell him all of the important stuff that he or she needs to worry about in that time. And then you can go back and do the deep read so that after he comes back with all of your client's questions about, well, what do they need to worry about? By then you'll have caught up. So that's how you read a rule in less than an hour. I had hoped to get a little bit farther through this one, but I forgot that I needed a little bit of time to do Shakespeare.
Yeah. Hey, thank you, Keith. And that's really amazing. And people can go to your Twitter feed for to get the whole reading of the rule. So thank you for that introduction.
Yep, and that starts now.
Yeah.
So.